Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, September 29th, 2020. Well, the Gladiators will assemble in Cleveland, Ohio tonight for the first presidential candidate debate of this election cycle. And I have several comments, things that you can watch for. One is, I fear that Joe Biden will be over-prepared, fed too many talking points and jabs against Trump, and that he'll stumble, trying to get it all out at once. And I hope that he doesn't deliver any serious gaffes. I also advise the former vice president to try to use humor to undercut Trump, who has no sense of humor, even though he often says he's joking about outrageous things that he proposes or tweets. And also, I will note that both candidates have deficits when it comes to public speaking. I would argue that they each speak different dialects of gibberish. And at his worst, Biden descends into kind of stumbles and self-interruptions, stitches different thoughts together that don't flow very well. And Trump, while many of his followers appear to be able to understand his form of gibberish, he just, jumps from one idea to the next, inserts an insult, then goes on to another one. And I think they're given 90 seconds or maybe up to 2 minutes to respond to a question from the moderator, Chris Wallace. And in 2 minutes, Trump can nail down 8, maybe even 10 different phrases or trigger words that get his followers bobbing their heads, saying, oh, yeah. These are policy statements from Trump. He never has to explain them or detail them, talk about how he will achieve them. And it is challenging to a guy like Biden to pick one or two of those on the laundry list that Trump has just blurted out and try to have a coherent response. Some advisors are telling him not to respond, just to let Trump ramble on and try to stick to his own talking points. But Trump makes it almost impossible to ignore his jabs, the name-calling, and the extreme characterizations that he often makes of Democrats like Biden. So it's going to be a cringeworthy event for viewers of all stripes. And we will see. I don't expect a winner to be declared, but there could be a loser. And I'll be watching like so many other people this evening. I'll have comments for you tomorrow. Now, will Joe Biden call out Trump as a tax fraud, a tax cheat, a grifter? Will he offer any details from the revelations of the New York Times about the chicanery that Trump has engaged in? Or will he stick to the safe stuff like, well, gosh, you only paid $750 in 2017, and Jill and I paid over $3 million in taxes? And I don't think Plugs Biden can go too far in criticizing Trump for spending and writing off $70,000 for hairstyling while he was a TV star on The Apprentice. So it'll be interesting to see just how hard Biden hits Trump. He may believe that in his effort to attract swing voters, independents, that he doesn't want to get caught up in a typical Washington back and forth. But I believe that he has to land some blows in order to show that Trump's attacks on him for being addled, senile, demented, either aren't true or aren't serious enough to get between Biden and voters. So it's going to be quite a shit show. There's just no doubt about it. Today's installment of the Tax Revelations from the New York Times runs 32 pages when I printed it out, and it's primarily focused on the deals that Trump made for the Apprentice TV show, the income he generated from it, just under $200 million, and the additional $230 million that came through endorsement deals and TV commercial projects, public speaking invitations, the fictional Trump University that he created and had to shut down. And the details are fascinating. Trump really doesn't own that much. He did buy the golf courses with proceeds from the Apprentice project. But he's been losing money on those golf courses, and he really only owns a handful of properties. Everything else he puts his name on is owned by somebody else, and he gets paid a licensing fee. So we're fascinated by all this. But will it really peel off any of his voters? Well, maybe a handful who are still waiting for their degree from Trump University or a refund after the court shut it down. But it doesn't appear that too many people who already support Trump find these revelations either surprising or disqualifying. One of the other issues that is likely to be added are those related to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And there's real conflict inside the Democratic Party. Biden, who presided over many confirmation hearings of this sort as chair of the Judiciary Committee for way too many years, he's using this lame approach to his former Republican colleagues in the Senate, appealing to their consciences. Well, they don't have consciences. And Joe fundamentally misreads those who are in the Senate, particularly the Republicans. And part of it is that it appears that he's thrown in the towel, that McConnell's got the votes, and that Democrats are better to focus on energizing their voters around the loss of Ginsburg and the replacement by Barrett, rather than being confrontational. And, of course, I think they should stand and fight at all costs. And I'm shocked to hear this comment from progressive Wisconsin Democrat Mark Pocan, a member of the House. In places like Wisconsin, what you talk about is COVID. The fact that people still can't go to a fish fry with their neighbors and friends. It's COVID and everything around COVID that gets talked about the most. I think Biden is still wisest talking about that. And as I mentioned yesterday, most Democrats are avoiding talking about abortion rights. They use coded language and dance around, reproductive rights, women's health care. But they're afraid to stand up and fight for that. And to me, that is a nearly tragic development. So I want to protect my source here, but on the down low, an activist emailed me just as I was getting ready to put the podcast together today, and I am learning that there is a very strong effort by activist groups who are quite well funded to stage a pitched battle in the Senate. And in a document that is like a war memo that I have in my hand right here, today an essential battle to protect the right of representative government isn't taking place on some distant shore, but rather in the Capitol itself. There are only 100 soldiers. One has stood up for a constituent's right to choose their own government. That's Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. One often pretends to defend her constituents, but ultimately cannot be trusted. That's Collins of Maine, and that's an accurate comment. 51 have chosen the preferences of their billionaire benefactors over those of their constituents, and 47 remain. Those 47 remaining soldiers must now choose how they will engage in the fight against their Republican colleagues. And so they are proposing the formation of a team of senators who would use every available parliamentary procedure. They call it a procedural strike force to delay, divert, and obstruct the efforts of Republicans to ram this through before November 3rd. And they've even put together a list. I'm going to read it for you. If one of these happens to be your member of the U.S. Senate, please call them, tell them to stand and fight, tell them to get on the procedural team here. And they are Baldwin of Wisconsin, Blumenthal of Connecticut, Booker, New Jersey, Brown, Ohio, Coons, Delaware, Cortez Masto, Nevada, Gillibrand, New York, Heinrich of New Mexico, Hirono of Hawaii, Markey of Massachusetts, Merkley of, it says Washington, but he's actually from Oregon, Murphy from Connecticut, Sanders, you know Bernie, Schatz from Hawaii, Tester, Montana, Udall, New Mexico, Warren of Massachusetts, Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Ask your senator to be one of the 11. Each will be amplified by a range of organizations to build a national echo chamber around this assault on American values. Well, I am heartened that there is an effort, that there are Democratic activists who have fight in them and who are trying to get our elected leaders, particularly Democrats in the Senate, that's where the action is, to stand and fight, even if they lose. I believe it's a worthy effort, and I recognize that it may not be successful. But I don't believe in acquiescing. And I want to read a post here that I found in my Facebook feed last night from a woman that I admire and often agree with, Congresswoman Jackie Speer, who represents a district just south of San Francisco. And she's not filtering her opposition. A vote for Amy Coney Barrett is a vote to destroy the Affordable Care Act. It's a vote to rob 135 million Americans with pre-existing conditions of their coverage, kick another 21 million off their health insurance amid a global pandemic that's killed more than 200,000 Americans. A vote for Barrett is a vote to end Roe v. Wade and strip women of their right to control their bodies and destinies. If Roe fell tomorrow, 24 states could ban abortion outright, returning us to the days of back-alley abortions and forcing victims of rape and incest to give birth to their attacker's child. A vote for Barrett undermines so much of the progress we've made in the areas of civil rights, labor rights, LGBTQ rights, climate change, and the rights of those seeking asylum and refuge on our shores. And a vote for Barrett less than 36 days before the general election, after 1 million Americans have already voted, after 70 million absentee ballots have been requested or sent to voters in 39 states and the District of Columbia, is a violation of every American's right to have their voice heard and the sanctity of the nomination process. There must be no confirmation until after the inauguration. That is a full-throated Democratic response to the provocation of this partisan effort to stack the court with another conservative, another Catholic, another pro-corporate justice. And I want to recommend to you a piece by Raul Diego, published today at Mid-Press News, about how the far extreme conservative Catholic group called Opus Dei has been in control of this process through the influence of Leonard Leo, the executive VP at the Federalist Society. They've been running Trump's appointments, and they did it for Bush as well. And Opus Dei, which counts among its members former Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, the current Attorney General Bill Barr, White House counsel Pat Cipollone. This has been described as one of the world's most powerful and politically committed secret societies with direct ties to the Vatican, and it goes all the way back to the Cold War. And Diego does a good job of explaining this entity, its influence, and how it is kind of a deep state or a shadow government influence here in the United States. And I want to highly recommend our latest in-depth interview podcast just being released today. I interviewed Professor Janet Jacobson from Columbia's Barnard College. Her new book is called The Sex Obsession, Perversity and Possibility in American Politics. And she has a chapter that is almost entirely devoted to the back and forth of the Supreme Court over the past 20 years. And as she comments on Amy Coney Barrett, she talks about the false notion of the progress narrative, where many of us on the left believe that we are inching forward day by day, year by year, into a more progressive nation. But in fact, we go forward, we go backward, and Amy Coney Barrett would take us back into the 1950s if she has her way with us. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Professor Jacobson.
Well, we have this progress narrative. Everything's getting better, except that we end up always back in the same place, in which it feels like social change is happening all the time, and yet certain things never seem to change, is what I call mobility for stasis. And I argue that one of the ways that incoherence between progress and democracy expanding and we always return to the same hierarchies is sustained in part by switching among issues. So sometimes we bring race to the fore, sometimes it's religious freedom, and we're always supposedly being open to freedom while also putting back some other issue. We're open to religious freedom in certain ways, I would argue only really for Christians, and we resist gender equality on that basis, and we switch. So with Amy Coney Barrett, what do we see? Well, there's been a lot of focus from the right on the idea that she will be opposed as a religious conservative to Roe v. Wade and abortion rights and perhaps broader questions of reproductive justice. There's been a lot of focus from the Democrats on the idea that, no, what really is going to go away is the Affordable Care Act, and I do think it is in danger, and we need to focus on that issue. What that leaves out is perhaps the biggest issue about her nomination, which is her openness to business interests, her support specifically from the PAC that was founded by the Koch brothers, and that this nomination is not necessarily a culmination of a fight over gender and sexuality and abortion rights. It is that, and it is also the culmination of a fight over workers' rights, over the ability of corporations to control the electoral process and to control political discourse in the United States. And that just disappears, right? There are very few articles that are focused on that, and I'm guessing that tonight will be a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and that won't be mentioned either.
That's Professor Janet Jacobson. She has some fascinating ideas how we need to break down a lot of binary thinking, where we're given false, very narrow choices, and look at the complexities. We talk about the Clinton administration of the 1990s, how it echoed Republican themes and Christianist themes on crime, on ending welfare, on demonizing teen pregnancy. And I just think she is quite a critical thinker who offers us new ways of breaking down old thinking. The podcast will be available later today for listeners with subscriptions. People like the fine folks at 7-Eleven Condo, you know who you are, Judy Holloway, Ben Brotman, and Carla Mahoney. They each chip in a few bucks every month to support my work here at the podcast. It covers my ink and paper bills, the cost of the internet, and occasionally I make a nickel or two out of this. You can join them too. Just visit peterbcollins.com/sign up. Well, this is open defiance of a federal court order. Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce, says that the gathering of data for the 2020 census is going to be cut off on October 5th, despite the fact that Judge Lucy Coe in District Court in San Jose, California, has explicitly issued a preliminary injunction ordering the suspension of this deadline for ending the head count and to continue all field operations until October 31st. So this open defiance and all of the gaming that Trump has engaged in, first trying to put a citizenship question on, the Supreme Court punted that on a technicality, then ordering the Census Bureau not to include non-citizens in the final count. They have been trying to game the census for years, and this is just the ultimate insult to the federal judiciary. In Washington today, Judge Emmett Sullivan held another hearing in the Mike Flynn case, where he heard the report from the special advocate regarding the effort by Attorney General Barr to withdraw the charges and dismiss the case against Mike Flynn for lying to the FBI. And as you know, the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, a small panel there had initially told Judge Emmett Sullivan that he should yield to the order from Bill Barr. And then Sullivan refused, and the full panel of the D.C. Circuit denied the request to shut down the charges and have the case just killed. So today's hearing turns on a federal rule that requires U.S. prosecutors to get leave of court permission from a judge before dismissing a prosecution. And so Judge Sullivan brought in this other judge named Gleason. And Gleason argued that the rule gives judges a limited but vital role, specifically to guard against politically corrupt dismissals. And Judge Sullivan also sounded skeptical of the Justice Department's assertion that Flynn's lies were irrelevant because they were not connected to another crime. And as you've heard a few months ago, Scott Ritter persuaded me that there is a technical legal basis for Barr to dismiss these charges. But at least my current reading of this is that Flynn's going to lose this one, and the judge will not dismiss the charges but will sentence him to a short term in federal prison. Well, the House has passed a $2.2 trillion, that's a scaled-back relief package that would provide aid to American families, businesses, schools, restaurants, and airline workers. And so Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin are now once again engaged in some sort of negotiation process, and we'll see if it actually produces some relief before the election. Yesterday, we reported to you that Brad Parscale, or is it Parscale, the former manager of Trump's campaign, he was the hero of 2016 for his dark targeting of individuals through social media. And then he was demoted in July after the embarrassment to Trump of the paltry turnout at the mob rally in Tulsa on June 20th. And as we described, he was drunk when the cops came to his house after his wife called them. She thought she had heard a gunshot and that he had killed himself. And he has been put into a psychiatric unit on a lockdown basis, and he now faces charges of domestic violence for physically abusing his wife, Candace. And get this, the White House is blaming Democrats and even some Republicans for whatever Brad Parscale's personal drama actually is. Here's a White House statement. The disgusting personal attacks from Democrats and disgruntled rhinos, that's Republicans in name only, have gone too far. They should be ashamed of themselves for what they've done to this man and his family. What did they do? I haven't heard of any direct attacks on Parscale. So that's how you distract, deflect, and divert attention in the Trump White House. Well, when I first reported the whistleblower revelations coming from the Irwin County Immigration Detention Center in rural Georgia, where a private detention company operates, and the grisly charges that women were being tricked or misled or pressured into gynecological surgery by a single doctor there, including women who reported that they had unwanted hysterectomies. Well, the New York Times had a kind of hands-off approach at first, but 3 reporters have dug into this case, and they're providing more information. They talk about a Jamaican immigrant who was later deported. She'd been in the U.S. for 20 years. And the outside gynecologist who saw patients at her immigration jail told her that the menstrual cramping she had was caused by large cysts and masses that needed to be removed. But she was skeptical. Still, she was brought to a local hospital in handcuffs and shackles. She felt pressure to consent. And after she was deported back to Jamaica, she got a hold of her medical records, and a radiologist's report showed that the claims by the doctor of these enlarged cysts that must be removed were false. And this is part of a pattern, as the Times and other outlets have delineated. There are at least 16 women who've been concerned about the female care that they got. All 16 were treated by Dr. Mahendra Amin. The cases the Times had were reviewed by 5 gynecologists who found that Dr. Amin consistently overstated the size or risks associated with cysts, and that he falsified charts, claiming that women had symptoms that they said they didn't have and they never reported. So I hope there'll be a full investigation, and I fear that this is not an isolated situation. But here in California, I'm pleased to report that on the stack of bills piled up on the governor's desk, and he just has a couple of days to wade through them all, he signed one on Sunday. Assembly Bill 3228 allows people who have been locked up by ICE to sue private detention facility operators for failing to comply with the standards of care and to collect reasonable costs and attorneys' fees. This grants them important rights that hopefully will lead these private prison operators to be humane and stop violating the rights of these non-citizens. And this is part of a bigger battle because the most recent version of AB 32, which was signed by the governor, calls for shutting all private prisons and detention centers at the end of this year. Oh, excuse me. The law went into effect, but they have to shut down by the end of 2028. Just before it took effect, ICE officials signed contracts valued at $6.5 billion with 3 companies that operate the California facilities, and the contracts have terms of 15 years plus 2 5-year extensions. So there is tension between state law and this federal action. But in a tentative ruling in July, a federal judge in San Diego said she was likely to dismiss most of the case against California and uphold its law. We shall see. So last Friday, I took the day off, and one of the breaking stories was that Trump had gone into a hissy fit around a report from a county in Pennsylvania where 9 mail-in ballots from overseas members of our military were found in a trash can. And Trump was really upset because apparently all of those ballots had been intended to be cast for him. So this feeds into his frenzy and all of the made-up claims that mail-in voting is a disaster, It's all rigged. It's going to favor the Democrats. And it's important to know that the county where this occurred is entirely controlled by Republicans. Trump said these ballots are a horror show. They found 6 ballots in an office yesterday in a garbage can. They were Trump ballots. 8 ballots in an office yesterday in a certain state. And they had Trump written on it, and they were thrown in a garbage can. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. And we're investigating that. It's a terrible thing that's going on with these ballots. Who is sending them? So we have seen that the only substantive mail-in ballot harvesting program was in a district in North Carolina in 2018 where Republican operatives were picking up ballots from voters and taking them to the elections office. It was pretty apparent that they only delivered ballots for the Republicans who were paying them. And so these minor incidents that Trump magnifies a million times in his little brain, they're all related to Republicans. And yet he has generated this massive smokescreen that the only way he can lose is if all these mail-in ballots result in rigging. So a little bit more on the case. This originated from a U.S. attorney, David Freed, Middle District of Pennsylvania, got the attention of Bill Barr, passed it along to Trump, and they turned this into at least a one-day crisis. And one of the other anomalies here is that under Pennsylvania law, elections workers can't open mail-in ballots until the morning of Election Day. So they went through the dumpsters, pulled everything out, and they're blaming this on one newly hired contractor who they still can't explain why those ballots ended up in his garbage can. Also in Pennsylvania, to try to drive home the message of how to vote by mail and how you have to insert your secret ballot in an envelope and then put that envelope in the other envelope. Well, if you don't put your ballot in the first envelope and just mail it back in the exterior envelope, your ballot won't count. It will be discarded as what's called a naked ballot. So Bethany Hallam, who is a member of the Allegheny County Council, she and some female buddies decided to pose for a photo where they are topless. They may be bottomless too, but we can't see that in the picture. And they are covering their upper bodies with these ballots and ballot envelopes. And in this amusing way, they're trying to educate voters not to mail in their naked ballots. In New York City, there is a big crisis emerging. 5 weeks ahead of Election Day, voters have been inundated with widespread invalid absentee ballots. The ballot errors appear to be concentrated in Brooklyn. Michael Ryan, executive director of New York City Board of Elections, is blaming the problem on a vendor in Rochester called Phoenix Graphics. Apparently, they have put the wrong labels on the ballot mailings, and this is causing a lot of confusion and upheaval. I have quite a few stories about election process that have piled up over the last few days. The Federal Election Assistance Commission has rebuked the nation's top voting machine manufacturer, which is ES&S Election Systems and Software, because they have falsely claimed that all of the voting machines that they're selling have been certified by the Election Assistance Commission, when in fact a bunch of the machines that have modems built in are not certified, and in particular states they cannot be deployed because the state regulations say no modems. That's an effort to prevent hacking by outsiders. And there's now an investigation, Lawyers for Free Speech for People, and a local election group in North Carolina exposed this problem, and we'll see if anything happens between now and Election Day. Meanwhile, the litigation over mail-in ballots is continuing. In Montana, a judge has extended the state's deadline, saying that voters have until the Monday after the Election Day for their ballots to be received. In Wisconsin, a federal appeals court has temporarily halted the 6-day extension that a lower court had granted for ballots to be received at the election office. And in North Carolina, the Republican National Committee sued to block state election officials from enforcing rule changes that could boost the number of ballots counted by allowing a later postmark, or basically an Election Day postmark, but it could be received for a period that has been extended. Because of all these different changes, local election offices are over budget. And Mark Zuckerberg and his wife have pledged $300 million in grants to try to cover the unanticipated expenses. This is leading to charges from Republicans that they are siding with the Democrats. And I don't believe that elections are conducted in a partisan way. They're not supposed to be. But the Zucks and the Terminator, former California Governor Schwarzenegger, has announced that he will issue grants to state and local election officials who want to reopen polling stations they closed because of a lack of funding. And here's a head-scratcher. The White House received a message from Vladimir Putin, who is offering a ceasefire. Putin extended an offer to Trump. Quote, "One of today's major strategic challenges is the risk of a large-scale confrontation in the digital field. We would like to once again address the U.S. with a suggestion to agree on a comprehensive program of practical measures to reboot our relations in the field of security in the use of information and communication technologies. We're proposing to exchange guarantees of non-intervention into internal affairs of each other, including into electoral processes." Now, as you know, I don't believe that Russia has successfully, in any significant way, meddled in the 2016 election, and I don't see any evidence so far. The BuzzFeed article that reports this offer from Putin cites the Microsoft study from about 10 days ago, where they reported on attempts to hack into 200 organizations, including campaigns, parties, and political consultants. But they failed to cite that the article said none of those attempted hacks have been successful. Details. And Pentagon leaders are trying to stay out of the election or enforcing the expulsion of Donald Trump from the White House. Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, "I believe deeply in the principle of an apolitical U.S. military. I foresee no role for the U.S. armed forces in this process. Trump has threatened to call out the military to guard polling places in a clear intimidation effort." Meanwhile, at The Intercept, reporter Alice Sperry has gotten a hold of an unredacted memo that was first issued in 2006. It's an FBI report on the effort by white supremacist groups to infiltrate law enforcement, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the earlier version that was released had some curious redactions, and the reporter here takes issue with why the redactions occurred. But in 2006, the FBI was concerned about self-initiated efforts by individuals, particularly among those already within the ranks of law enforcement, to volunteer their professional resources to white supremacist causes with which they sympathize. Having personnel within law enforcement has historically been and will continue to be a desired asset for white supremacist groups. Do you think? The report here says some redactions don't seem to be justified. For instance, the FBI's conclusion that white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement can result in other abuses of authority and passive tolerance of racism. I agree. I don't see any need to redact that. It's just embarrassing, and that's what a lot of secrecy is all about. The New York Times today has an interesting report about the Minneapolis City Council. After the death of George Floyd and the massive protests, the council voted to pledge to defund the city's police department. Various language was used by different members of the council. Some talked about ending policing as we know it. Others talked about shifting budgets from the police department to other important services. And others talked about simply renaming the department as part of a possible restructuring. But the mayor, Jacob Frey, who had run for office pledging to reform the police department, he dissented. And now the whole effort apparently has crumbled. And one of the key players, Keith Ellison's son, Jeremiah, who serves on the council, was one of the three people who wrote and negotiated that pledge that was agreed to back in June. But in the intervening period, the Black Lives Matter movement has declined in popularity, and there is a kind of shift, some of it driven by Trump and his law and order message, some by African Americans in Minneapolis who said, we weren't consulted and we don't want to disband the police. We want fair policing in our communities. There was also a local newspaper poll that found that 50% of black people opposed reducing the size of the police department. So I'm sorry to see that this has fizzled out. It's not like I expected that everything they promised would be written into law. But I fundamentally believe the Minneapolis Police Department can't be reformed. And like Camden or other locales, they need to, over time, dismantle the existing police department and build up a replacement. Partly to get rid of the bad apples and the protective union contracts that keep those bad apples in uniform and on the streets. Yesterday, we reported the misconduct of the police officers at the crime scene where Breonna Taylor was gunned down this past March. And now a juror, part of the grand jury, that declined to charge the officers who shot and killed Breonna and instead gave a wrist slap of an indictment to a cop who was outside the apartment, who, after the gunfire exchange began, fired rounds wantonly that went into another apartment unit. So the African-American Attorney General of Kentucky, Republican Daniel Cameron, has granted the request of the grand juror to speak publicly and said that recordings of the grand jury session and transcripts will be made public. The allegation of this grand juror is that they were not given a full range of options. And that basically they just instructed the grand jury that they couldn't charge the detectives who shot and killed Breonna Taylor because they were justified because her boyfriend had fired one shot into the leg of one of the invading officers. So this is very significant. But after all, it is Kentucky. They'll pour some bourbon, smoke some tobacco, and try to cover this up. We'll see if they're successful. Last night in Portland, 4 months of nonstop protesting. And the cops used a different tactic, kind of a pre-crime approach. They decided to break up the protests before they even got organized. They swept through a park where the protesters were gathering. They confiscated their homemade shields. They caught the protesters off guard, But the protesters regrouped and moved toward the police union building. The police declared an unlawful assembly, and there were some back and forth exchanges of, push and shove by each side. And about 150 protesters made it to the union office, where once again it was declared an unlawful assembly. They didn't allow them to walk in the streets. They had to use the sidewalks. 24 people were arrested. And what's been interesting is that last weekend, a number of officers on the rapid response team were deputized as federal officers. Now, it's not clear to me if the governor or the mayor of Portland approved this. But this appears to be an end run on the local prosecutor who has said that he will not pursue minor charges against demonstrators, and it allows Bill Barr and the federal Justice Department to step in when these federally deputized local cops press a complaint. Also, Ryan Devereaux at The Intercept followed up on the Proud Boys protests in the streets of Portland last weekend, which kind of fizzled out. There weren't that many boys who wanted to be proud. But he notes, in the end, it was the local police who were responsible for violence in the streets, as dozens of riot cops chased protesters in the press from the County Justice Center and pummeled them with fists and clubs following an order to disperse. And he notes, as I just did, that ahead of the rally, 50 cops assigned to the Portland Police Bureau's rapid response were deputized as federal marshals. In Texas, a rare indictment of a sheriff. The Williamson County Sheriff, whose name is Robert Chody, a Republican, has been indicted because there was an incident where an African-American man named Javier Ambler was chased by police. He didn't stop. And all of this was being captured by a TV crew from a reality show called Live PD. And I am bitterly opposed to this using local cops and their beat patrols as fodder for television shows like Cops. So under the agreement, the TV crew actually filmed the entire scene, but the tape was destroyed under instructions from the county sheriff, Robert Chody. So he's now been indicted by a grand jury for evidence tampering just weeks before he is on the ballot for re-election. And Chody denies. He said, "I didn't tamper with evidence." This is a political stunt, he believes. As we do every day, we bring you coverage from the extradition hearing of Julian Assange being conducted at the Old Bailey in London. We start with Kevin Gostola's report on yesterday's session, which was mostly about the question of whether the guarantees that are offered by the United States that Julian Assange will not be put in solitary confinement can be believed. And a couple of witnesses were on the stand who have experience with the Arlington Detention Center in Virginia, where he will be initially held if he is sent to the United States for trial, and the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. And essentially, the witnesses said the U.S. government is lying. And the restrictions placed in the confinement will be the equivalent of solitary, and that it will be even more restrictive if he is designated by the Attorney General for SAM, Special Administrative Measures. And as usual, Craig Murray, who is one of the handful of people who is actually permitted to observe the trial in person, he said yesterday was the worst day for the defense since the start of the trial. Their expert witnesses failed to cope with the sheer aggression of cross-examination by the U.S. government and found themselves backing away from maintaining propositions they knew to be true. It was uncomfortable viewing, says Murray. It was a day when the divorce between truth and court process was plainer than usual. Given the horrific reality this process was disguising, it was a hard day to sit through. So he describes the same testimony. He does offer an attempt at a transcript. He says it's the best that he can capture as the testimony flies by. But it does show the withering cross-examination that is permitted to go on and on and on, even though the original testimony by the witness is limited to 30 minutes, which is just such an obvious bias in favor of the government requesting the extradition, and that would be the United States of America. And in today's update from Consortium News, which is about the Tuesday session in the court, they describe that Judge Baratzer is considering a request for 2 witnesses from the UC Global Spanish security firm to have their testimony read in court and to grant them anonymity. I would be surprised if she approves this, but in a blockbuster follow-up report at the Gray Zone Project, Max Blumenthal adds to the disclosures he's already provided about the role of Sheldon Adelson's firm, the Sands Casino operation from Las Vegas, and its executive protection director, he's the security guy for the casino, Zohar Lahav, who has forged a close friendship with David Morales. He is the head of the Spanish company UC Global. They had the contract from Ecuador to conduct the security at the embassy, and it appears that after getting a second contract with Las Vegas Sands, they enhanced the surveillance measures, including the bathrooms and DNAing the diapers loaded with poop from Julian's kids. And now a Spanish court is demanding testimony from Lahav and perhaps his boss, who is a guy named Brian Nagel. This all could lead to exposure of Adelson as an asset of the CIA and disclosure of whether the information that was available to the spooks at Sands was shared with the CIA, as is widely suspected. So I invite you to follow the link in the show file for today's podcast and check out Blumenthal's latest report. Here's today's COVID-19 update, which is edited by Linda Lewis. She found 2 sources of data. Johns Hopkins reporting that the worldwide total death related to coronavirus is over 1 million now, with a total of 33.4 million cases. In the United States, Johns Hopkins reports 205,000 deaths against 7.1 million cases, while the COVID Tracking Project says that the U.S. death toll is still under 200,000 at 197. And the caseload is similar, just a little lower, at 7.1 million. We currently nationwide have 29,000 people hospitalized, 5,900 in ICUs, and Linda notes that the new deaths reported yesterday at 257 is suspiciously low. It was 869 last week, but we have seen wide fluctuations in the reported death count, and it underscores the lack of credibility in the chain of custody of these points of data. So as we cross the 1 million threshold, here's some quick summaries about the hotspots. The U.S. currently leads the world in both number of dead and total number of infected. Many states have managed to bring down their numbers, as well as the overall U.S. daily death count. Yet it remains far higher than it was in July, and both New York and California are raising concerns that the positive rate from testing is growing and that is on a per 100,000 basis. The second biggest driver in the worldwide death toll is Brazil. It is once again in trouble. Brazil's initial response was chaotic, but more recently, progress appears to be stalled. In India, where the government largely lifted a lockdown in May, infections and deaths have been on a virtually uninterrupted upward spiral. Mexico is struggling as well. It has the fourth highest count. It doesn't just follow the U.S., Brazil, and India. Over the last 2 weeks, all four countries have had the highest number of average daily deaths. And the United Kingdom, ranked fifth when it comes to the total death toll, is faring only slightly better than Mexico. New infections have risen to their highest level since early May, and hospitalizations are rising. Top officials at the White House pressured leaders at the CDC to downplay the risk of the coronavirus to children as Trump pushed to reopen schools this fall. Citing documents and interviews with current and former government officials, the New York Times reported today the push included an effort to find data suggesting the pandemic was weakening and did not threaten children. And last Friday, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, after convening a panel of people who all are skeptics of the COVID response, including masks and lockdowns and school reopenings, DeSantis announced the elimination of all previously implemented restrictions for his state. It removes state-level social distancing requirements, capacity limits for businesses, including restaurants and bars. It is a daring move for a state currently recording more than 100 deaths from COVID-19 each day. During Friday's announcement, DeSantis repeatedly referenced the roundtable he had hosted the day before. He claims that he met with a group of highly credentialed and respected doctors. But when you look at the list, they're all people who have been skeptics for months now. An Arkansas school superintendent died Tuesday from the illness caused by the coronavirus. The Atkins School District announced that Superintendent Jody Jenkins died due to complications from COVID-19. He announced on September 13th he had tested positive and had been hospitalized for the last few days. Arkansas has a 6.9% test positivity rate, the 17th highest in the country. In the latest pandering to voters, the Trump White House has deployed a new rapid coronavirus test, describing them as game changers. They're fast, cheap, and easy to use. But the deployment of them has left people puzzled. Health officials in several states said that they've been allowed no say in where the new tests are being sent, sometimes don't know which nursing homes will receive them until the night before a shipment arrives. The lack of federal planning has left states with no standardized way to capture results from the new tests and include them in the daily counts. And these are not PCR tests, which have to go to a laboratory to be analyzed. These are Abbott Laboratories' antigen test called Binax Now. And I don't have any clear indication of what the credibility is of these new tests that are being rolled out. And finally today, I want to note that the skeptics have created a lot of doubt among average Americans, particularly younger people who believe that even if they get the coronavirus, it won't kill them. Well, a 20-year-old college football player named Jermaine Stevens has died after being tested positive from coronavirus and contracting pneumonia. And he was described as a guy who was very popular on campus at California University of Pennsylvania. And it is touching to read his story. And it's also distressing to see how he thought he caught a cold from his roommate. Then he went to a party on campus where there were more than 10 people, which has drawn a threat from the administration to shut down any further parties. And he basically was hospitalized on August 31st, and he was buried last Friday. Now, this is anecdotal. I recognize that the data show that not large numbers of 20-year-olds are dying. But I think people are getting way too relaxed about this, blasé. And as corporate interests demand either further bailouts or relaxation of restrictions, as we head into the cooler season where the predictions are that the virus will spike again, I, for one, am going to remain vigilant. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.